Good evening. Welcome to the 2020 Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference Evening Reading Series. My name is Sean Hill, and I'm the conference director. This is our 8th conference, and Alison Hawthorne Deming's reading this evening will be our 3rd of 6 readings this week. Alison is returning faculty, and I'm so glad she accepted our invitation to come back. And I'm excited to hear her read tonight. We've gathered a small gallery to give Alison the sense of all of you gathered this evening. We will represent you well. Sarah Dennison, our conference administrator, and I will moderate the Q&A following the reading. There are a few people and entities I need to thank on behalf of the conference and myself. We want to thank the poets collected in the New Poets of Native Nations anthology and Hyde Erdrich, its editor, and Grey Wolf Press for their generous donation in support of the New Poets of Native Nations Women's Scholarship. We also want to thank an anonymous past participant for their generous donation in support of the Charles W. Scrutcheon Emerging Writer of Color Scholarship. This conference is supported in part by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So thank you, Minnesotans. And we want to thank Bemidji State University for its support and encouragement. We are glad for our place in the Northwoods at Bemidji State University beside the lake known as Bemidji Gamog, where the river crosses, which has been a sacred gathering place for countless generations of indigenous peoples, including Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabe, who remain the spiritual caretakers and thriving members of the greater community to which we all belong. Situated as we are between 3 Ojibwe reservations, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake. We recognize and support the sovereignty of Native nations. We will continue to work with Indigenous teachers, elders, and youth to protect and honor all of our relationships with the land and all our relatives and the truth. Alison Hawthorne Deming is the author of 5 nonfiction books, most recently Zoologies on Animals and the Human Spirit, called Eloquent, Sensitive, and Astute by a reviewer in the Kirkus Review. She's also published 7 collections of poetry, most recently Stairway to Heaven, which a Publisher's Weekly reviewer called an imagist gem that is urgent and masterly in its evocation of place, limnity, and waking dreams. She's also published a collaboration with photographer Stephen Strom titled Death Valley, Paint It Light, and she's edited 2 anthologies, Poetry of the American West, a Columbia anthology, and more recently, The Colors of Nature, essays on culture, identity, and the natural world. Multi-talented and prolific. She has received numerous fellowships and awards from various institutions, including from Stanford University, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and the National Endowment for the Arts. 2 of those, she's reached her limit. Alison is Regents Professor and Agnes Nelms Horry Chair of Environment and Social Justice at the University of Arizona, where in 2015 she founded the Field Studies in Writing program. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, and Grand Manan, New Brunswick, Canada. It is with great pleasure we give you Alison Hawthorne Deming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for all of the staff for the remarkable work you've done to create community in this new two-dimensional world of ours. It's been a remarkable experience, and I know we're all very grateful for it. I'm going to take you far away from wherever you are tonight. I'm going to take you to a small island off the eastern coast of Canada for most of my reading, the island of Grand Manan, which is in the Bay of Fundy that lies between the province of New Brunswick and the province of Nova Scotia. And the image you see before you and behind me is the image of a herring weir. This is a structure that is a commercial adaptation of indigenous fish weirs that have probably been used for 1,000 or thousands of years along the eastern seaboard and the west. And this is something that is I have written about. You'll hear about it tonight. This is an offshore fixed gear fishery. And you might think this is a work of art, not a work of an industry, but it is in fact the work of an industry. You'll hear a little bit about it tonight. But I'm happy to invoke that place tonight, which was a native home of the Passamaquoddy people, although they never, we don't believe, lived on Grand Manan Island, but they often paddled over from Maine in gigantic canoes to harvest shellfish and other animals, probably porpoises, etc., and dry them on the beach and take them home. So I was so moved, as I know everybody was, by Robin's presentation yesterday, with the two of them. And I was particularly moved in the evening in the discussion about grief and our discussion about hungering for ritual and, you know, the appropriation of Native ritual and how that's problematic. And when she said, well, you have to invent rituals if you don't have them. Don't steal ours. And I have an essay in Zoologies that's about that. And I thought it would be good to read because I know that all of us are living with a great deal of grief right now, a great deal of grief. We've got COVID, we have state-sanctioned murder on our streets, we have hundreds of years of racial injustice without truth and reconciliation. And I have my forest on fire here, in my forest in Tucson. So it's a deeply destabilized time, not to mention the destruction of democracy and the rule of law in America. So grief comes in many forms and it has many ways of visiting us these days. One of the things I learned in writing this book, Zoologies, was that it's very hard to know what to do with the grief one feels about the diminishment of the natural world and all of those creatures and beings that support our creaturely life and being. And sometimes there are lessons you learn about more intimate forms of grief, the loss of family members, that help you with the larger griefs. And that's what I'm going to read to you tonight, an essay called Liberating the Lobster. I'm also going to read to you from newer work. Every summer since 1956, I have returned to Grand Manan Island in the Bay of Fundy, where my parents bought a fisherman's cottage that was built in 1864. The place is a bit derelict, cedar shingles covered with lichen, the fieldstone cellar sodden as a swamp, the old chimney covered with a plywood and fiberglass box to stop the creosote-stained leakage. The cottage has stood up pretty well, considering that it is neglected for most of the year. From my deck, I watch Swallowtail Lighthouse, keeping its vigil, the ferry with its regular arrivals and departures, setting the rhythm of the place, sea kayaks slicing past the bell buoy and along the glass flat bay, a scow hauling a load of top stakes and twine as it heads out to her herring weir, lobster boats heading home from the salmon cages, the bay pinked with sunset. I'm like the migratory right whales and Arctic terns that keep this place on their annual map. They come here to breed, I come here to brood. I like the affinity between the two words. I have no intention of incubating young birds or nursing a young mammal, but there is something generative about thinking deeply, even thinking darkly into things. On the island, the thinking is often accomplished while I'm hiking along seaside cliffs in the woods or cutting back the hardhack and alders that threaten to overtake my small perches on domestic life. The body in motion encourages thought. The more active I become, the more requited the thinking becomes. This can be problematic for a writer, as I cannot go anywhere without carrying a notebook. If I lose a pen in the woods, I have to practice stringent techniques of mind control to keep the bounty of words from falling like dead leaves to the ground. I should master the palace of memory strategy used by the ancients, but it seems a bit too grandiose for my woodland meanderings. Maybe I should try using the island's villages for a mnemonic. North Head, standing for the first spark of inspiration. Castalia, for settling into reverie. Woodward's Cove, where the old fish houses perch for grounding the idea in the concrete. Grand Harbor, where the great old sailing ships anchored for going into history. And Seal Cove, for including the lives of animals within the human story. But last year I needed no mnemonic. My brother's death was the urgency that called me. In August 2011, after 2 months of back pain, he'd received the diagnosis of small cell cancer of the prostate that had metastasized to the spine. This is a very rare cancer. Fewer than 1% of prostate cancers have this designation. It's usually advanced at diagnosis because it doesn't show up on the routine prostate-specific antigen tests. The median survival rate is 10 months. My brother died 7 months after the diagnosis and just shy of his 67th birthday. In the last 2 months of his life, I helped facilitate his care and finances, both of which had fallen into frightening disarray. The cancer had moved to his brain. He'd lost the ability even to operate a TV remote or a cell phone. He wasn't sure about the name of the doctor or which of the 14 or so meds he was supposed to take at what time. His wife was hysterical and long addicted to prescription pain medication. He had lived hard since adolescence, finding in drugs a transcendence that drew him. I remember his excitement in 1965 when he first discovered weed. I remember the day, the moment, his joy. White kids from the suburbs did not smoke weed in those days. It was the era of reefer madness, an underground thing for the uber and urban hip. He found his way from our pastoral town into the inner city. He was drawn to the outlaw mystique, where he scored. He was stoked with evangelical zeal right away, a conversion experience. Life had finally gotten real. Weed was first, and dabbling in meth and heroin. A long marriage to hallucinogens and a gluttonous stretch of cocaine that led to dealing and doing time. Perhaps he had a problem, as the current addiction thinking suggests, with the neurochemistry of reward. Great hunger, little reward, keep feeding hunger, keep feeling the lack of reward. He would not have seen it this way. He saw himself as a spiritual seeker, a shaman living in Los Angeles, working construction and writing screenplays and adventuring in the far ranges of consciousness, using pharmaceuticals as his guide. He saw himself as a hero, or at least a survivor of the underground. It's ironic that he died from a disease that requires a pharmaceutical dance of such complexity and ferocity that managing the meds becomes a full-time job. My brother loved lobsters. Summers, when the family drove up from Connecticut to Grand Banana, we stopped to visit friends of our parents who lived in West Gouldsboro, Maine. They took us into Frenchman Bay on their speedboat. We beached near the base of Cadillac Mountain, clambering out onto the stony shore for a picnic supper. We smashed open the lobster shells with rocks, drenching ourselves with their juices and throwing the red calciferous remains into the sea. My brother had been a sullen and silent child. He resisted what my mother offered at home, which made him subject to routine hectoring about his failures at the dinner table. Under beach party rule of law, he dove into lobsters like a predator, smashing and ripping, sucking the juices out of each fat claw and skinny leg, plucking the sweet meat out of every crevice and asking for more. Long after everyone had leaned back onto a boulder in satisfaction, he'd be smashing another crustacean open, juice running up his arms and down his chin, and picking out the white morsels of meat. "Do you want another lobster, Rodney?" the hosts would tease after he'd begun to look like he'd had an overdose. Lobsters are crustaceans. They wear their skeletons on the outside of their bodies like a crust and shed them as they grow. When they're young and growing, they may shed 10 times a year, later once every few years. A lobster's like a snake that outgrows its skin and must shed the sac shaped like its body to make room for the new one. After molting, a lobster is vulnerable to predators for a few weeks. After molting, a female emits a pheromone that makes males less aggressive and signals her readiness for mating. The couple enters into a closed claw courtship dance. This is a good thing because lobsters can be nasty and pugilistic. So could my brother. In captivity, they can become cannibalistic, but they calm down for sex. The American lobster loves the colder waters of the north, its range extending from North Carolina to Labrador. At least, that has been the range for as long as people have been around to notice. Lobsters have lived in the sea since the great age of dinosaurs, where they've enjoyed their benthic lifestyle in the deep past in their own private manner. The oldest fossil lobster on record dates back to the early Cretaceous, the geologic period that began about 150 million years ago and ended 65 million years ago with the cataclysmic extinction that took down the dinosaurs. All during this period, lobsters were scuttling about the ocean floor on their 10 legs and breaking open shellfish for supper. The breakup of Pangea had begun, flowering plants had begun, magnolia, ficus, and sassafras, beginning to outnumber ferns, horsetails, and cycads. Whatever the lobsters have been doing, it has worked. Next to their species' longevity, ours is negligible. They have been on Earth about 600 times longer than we have. There's a whole lot of natural history stuff, which I'm going to skip. As late as 1800, according to Grand Manan historians, lobsters were so plentiful in that region, in all the little bays and coves, that almost anyone could go wading in low water and pick up enough for dinner. No great value was placed on the fish, Ingersoll wrote. It was not uncommon for cartloads to be hauled on the fields for fertilizer after storms had driven them up on the beaches and in great windrows. In fact, some of the old timers on the island will say to me, "Oh yes, when I was a child, all we had was lobsters to eat, and we were ridiculed when we took that lobster to school in a bag for our lunches because that was the food that was really a food of poor people." In colonial times, lobsters were so bound. Oh, sorry. Oops, been there. The biggest lobster on record is a 44-pounder caught off Nova Scotia. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records. A lobster that size could be 100 years old. Lobsters don't seem to weaken or lose fertility with age. This has been tested out in labs. The enzyme telomerase just keeps repairing their DNA sequences. In theory, a lobster could live forever. Lobsters figure prominently in Grand Manan's history. It's one of the fisheries that helped the culture thrive for the past 200 years. Now that the ground fish, cod, haddock, and pollock are diminished, lobsters are one of the last remaining sources of economic security for the island's 2,000 residents. This is a hard-working and pragmatic place, yet it drifts now into the future. The island was long the smoked herring capital of the world. Ingersoll reports that in 1898, 500,000 boxes, 18 pounds each, of smoked herring were produced and sold for export to the West Indies market. In 1880, 1 million boxes were processed and shipped. Herring were, and still are to a lesser extent, caught in brush wares, like this one, constructed offshore, graceful structures that look more like art than work, stakes ringed around and set into the seabed, top stakes of birch saplings lashed to stakes, and twine hung to form the seine. Herringware is iconic of the place, a harmony between nature and culture inspired by the extreme tides of the Bay of Fundy. Now herring are sparse. Dulse, a nutritious purple seaweed gathered for world markets, is diminishing as the ocean warms. Salmon aquaculture continues, but without the verve that came with the first wave of the industry. There are too many unknowns: how to minimize pollution of the bay, prevent the viral attacks of infectious salmon anemia, and prevent farmed stock from escaping and entering rivers like the Magadavik, where they interbreed with and weaken wild fish. Lobsters, however, are plentiful. Some monitors say that's because the groundfish are gone, so the small lobsters have a better chance to survive. A biologist told me that warming waters to the south mean lobsters are moving north. Good news for the Bay of Fundy, bad news for Massachusetts. For now. How long before the lobsters head to Labrador? After my brother died, it was a comfort to be alone at the family cottage, a good place for grieving and contemplation. As a refuge, the island was that summer, as it has always been, a place of beauty, rugged tranquility, and simple living. For 1 week, I was flattened by grief: sleep, read, nap, work. Only manual work satisfied: plaster the walls, clear the trail, haul junk to the dump, air out musty pillows and blankets in the sea breeze. The waves some night were loud as they thrummed the rocky shore, just like the cadences of grief that came in waves. My neighbor came one day to fell 3 dead spruce trees, the latest victims of the woodland beetle depredation on the island. When the trees started dying, my neighbors consoled me, "Oh, Alison, it's just their time." But after dozens went, after whole hillsides began to look like their green hair had turned gray, it became clear that this was not ruin on the expected time scale of arboreal aging and decline. Woodland parasites are doing well in many forests with warmed winters, allowing more larvae to make it through the cold. Parasites emerging in the spring and feasting through the bark. Over the past 2 or 3 years, I've lost 30 or 40 black spruces and tamaracks. Some were wider than I can compass with my arms, grand elders I'd admired, because on a working island where the forest has been used for 2 centuries for ships' masts and weir stakes and house timbers, a tree that old is one you tend to notice. There was a spruce in front of my writing studio with an uncanny curving trunk, as if it had had to weave its way past fallen limbs as it climbed. The obstacles were long gone, but the waves in the wood remained. When the trees were cut, the chainsaw stopped roaring and there was silence. Then the trunk cracked at the juncture where the wood had its last grasp on the vertical. It was strangely beautiful to watch the old giants lean, hold, lean, and then go, released. They landed in a muffled whoosh, dry branches cushioning the fall. The birds kept me company, singing from what was left of the woods. On the day the last 3 spruces fell, the forest went crazy, with cowbirds screaming about the disruption. By the next day, they were gone. I wanted to be like them, adjusting to loss, letting my complaint rip, then moving on. Or like the forest ground that wastes not a minute contemplating ruin. Here, 30 tiny spruces sprout. Here, a spread of wild raspberries leap. Here, the yellowthroats call back and forth across the new opening, all beings embracing the new exposure to the sun. Grief can flatten you. What is its purpose? At a gathering of writers that spring, convened by Orion Magazine to discuss the theme of loss and resilience, Carolyn Finney said that many people feel no grief. She asked, "Does it make sense to think about grief and loss?" John Elder said, "Grief is about liberation, not being stuck and moving forward." Kathleen Dean Moore said, "Love is a necessary condition for grief. Grief is a necessary condition for love." Ruben Martinez said that grief's renunciation and withdrawal to the desert forces us into interior process and moral awakening. Sandra Steingraber said, 1 in 4 mammals, coral reefs, tipping points, reinforcing feedback loops. A dissident said, grief, what good is it? Julia Whitty said, grief is a natural state, knowledge of the ephemeral. We are undefended in grief. A new world within is being constructed. Someone said, it helps to have a ritual. I liberated a lobster into the Bay of Fundy in honor of my brother. He loved lobster, and he loved the Bay of Fundy. I bought the 1.25 pound lobster at the Fundy House takeout. A few dozen lobsters were all jammed together in the fish tank, lying in a semi-torpid heap. Just one? The proprietor asked. Just one. She was kind enough to give me a restaurant-sized Heinz ketchup can to carry it in. I did not tell her what I wanted the lobster for. What was the point? I'd never been on the island that late in the fall. The blackberry leaves had turned crimson, the alders a pillow of gold on the steep shore leading from the cottage to the stony beach. The white birches had gone bare. The apple trees held on to their last fruits of the season, even as the leaves blew away. The sky hung low with steely clouds. Rain squalls came in and blew out. The tide was low. I walked across the gauntlet of rockweed-covered boulders to get to the tide pools, slipping and sliding, a lobster in one hand, scissors in the other. When I got to the water's edge, I turned around to watch the last of the conflagration on the beach. I'd lit a fire in the Heinz can, my brother's death certificate, the official seal of California with its conquistadors and Eureka motto, going up in smoke, along with a few strips of cedar wainscoting left over from the job he'd done at the cottage a few years back on his rare visit to the island. I snipped the rubber bands from the lobster's claws and set it in the icy tide pool. What happened then is not at all what I expected. I'd thought of doves set free at a wedding, bursting forth into exuberant freedom. I thought the lobster would sense freedom and swim. Yes, I thought it would swim for the depths. Wouldn't it be coded to hightail it for the benthic zone? May you travel well into the vastness, I said. A small bit of theater in the face of the eternity of water stretching out as far as I could see. The lobster, of course, had no use for my exhortation. And what could I know of my brother's spirit, which had become even more inscrutable with his death? Lobsters walk, I later learned, or they swim backward by curling and uncurling their abdomens. And young lobsters, like my little rescue, live in burrows or crevices within 10 feet or so of the shore. This lobster knew just what to do. Backing its way into a nook between 2 boulders, it dug out a burrow with its swimmerettes, scooping and plowing, sometimes head first, sometimes tail. Periwinkles kept losing their grip, their suction on the rocks to fall into the water at low tide, their percussion sounding like slow castanets. A few long-clawed hermit crabs scuttled their homes along on walking legs. Some creature that looked like a tiny black softball with a tail darted around in the crystalline water of the tide pool. I gathered up a few periwinkles and tossed them in front of the lobster as it lay nestled in its keep. It didn't budge. I felt silly and satisfied, a little levity rising as my expectation for transcendence gave way to biology. No, I thought, this is it. What grief demanded all along was trust in the learning embedded in every organism. I could see the grounds for that trust in the dignity with which my brother met his end. I don't know what happens next, my brother had worried. No one does, I said. You've hungered for the spirit world all of your life, and now it's very close. Yes, he said, I've seen glimpses of it, and it was very beautiful. Hold on to that. It means your body knows how to do this. I could see the grounds for that trust in the sureness with which the liberated lobster dug itself a home. Maybe instinct is a measure of the spiritual life of animals, something they can't control that drives them to their fate, something insubstantial that becomes as real as solid things. Okay, thanks. I'm going to move on. I want to talk a little bit about this book. We'll see how long it takes. I'll read one or two short pieces from this new book that's coming out. It had the working title for a long time called Lament for the Makers. And some of you may recognize that title from our W.S. Merwin book, in which he paid homage to the poets who had been important to him. And he had done that book in homage of a 15th century poet, William Dunbar, who had written a lament for the makers about the poets who had influenced him. And I was very moved by that. And I thought, well, not only have other writers influenced me, but there are cultures that have fed and nourished me. And this whole notion of human making has fed and nourished me and gives me hope. And so I wanted to write a book that was not only a lament for the makers, but also a celebration perhaps of them, and to think about those maker cultures that had been so important in my own life. And there are two of them. One is this fishery on Graminan. I'm going to focus on that tonight. The other is my grandmother and great-grandmother, who were dressmakers, first in Paris and then in New York City. Some of you were here a couple of years ago when I was here. I read a couple of chapters about the dresses. So this is a weird and wonderful book now called The Sardine Dress, because that's a dress that's chapter 1, and it's a Yves Saint Laurent dress, which I read to those of you who were here last time. So this is a weird dress. It's a braid, fashion, fisheries, and family. And I'm sticking with the fisheries tonight, but I am deeply grateful to the Guggenheim Foundation that gave me the fellowship, that allowed me and inspired me and encouraged me to pursue a project that seemed somewhat implausible, and now is a book that will be coming out from Counterpoint Press in the fall of 2021. So I'd like to read you the prologue of that book. I think the book really is about the beauty and fragility of human making, and this desire to defy the erasure of this fishery. There used to be, in the 1930s, there were 90 of these structures around the island. Every 1,000 feet, there was a herring weir. Now there are 8 or 9, and they will not last because large corporate fisheries are taking over traditional fisheries. And in the case of my grandmother and my great-grandmother, because those businesses were run by women, there's no record. Often women-run home-based businesses didn't count. So here they were, accomplished, skillful, artistically gifted to make these fabulous dresses in the Gilded Age, no record. So yes, a celebration of the beauty and fragility of making, and just defying the fact that you can't find the story and saying, I'll make a story, darn it. So I'll read you the prologue here. This also came out of Robin's, that was a moment in her reading that was so wonderful. She talked about the unmaking. And I said, wait a minute, Robin, the prologue to The Sardine Dress is called The Unmaking. The kitchen wing of our 1864 Castalia cottage had been slumping down into the earth for decades. Sill beams laid on bare soil had crumbled, making the walls sink. The shelves that held our dishes and glassware had tilted wallward. The floor listed and rippled like a fun house. A gap had grown between the kitchen wing and the main house, inviting rain, mice, and fearsomely huge black ants to run rampant, each in their season. After my parents were gone, stewardship of the summer place became the price I paid for spending a few months each year in the Canadian Maritimes. The house, on the other hand, spent the whole year on the stormy shore of the Long Bank, battened by wind and snow and rain and ice, saturated with fog and salt air, invaded by mold and mildew. The roof shingles were busting up from where the old brick chimney sieved creosote into rainwater and snowmelt, making gruesome watercolor abstractions on the ceilings. And while the old fieldstone cellar walls held generally upright, one corner had caved to external forces. The house was unmaking itself. Half of my neighbors told me to finish the job and tear the whole thing down. 150 years is long enough, they said. The other half said, how could you tear that house down? It's been here 150 years. Who built that house anyway, they asked. Then the stories began. A fisherman grew up here who was lost at sea for a week in his dory. And crusty quips relegating me to outsider status, though our family have owned the place since 1957. You're living in my grandfather's house. The more I learned about the place, the more I imagined the lives that had gone before me and came to feel somehow that I was their keeper. I knew the house would not go down on my watch, at least not the whole of it. But I had to have the kitchen wing torn down, and I hired the local carpenter, Larry Small, to reno what remained. New windows and doors, gut out plaster insulate, new pine tongue and groove boards for the walls, no kitchen, no bathroom, a camp sink. It will become an artist studio for my daughter, who plans to keep our family story moving forward in this place. Demolition has its pleasures. In 2 hours, a backhoe and dump truck can turn a house into a vacant lot. A few bites through the roof, a few scoops of lath and plaster, smashed windows and linoleum, and the wing was smoothed to bare dirt, an open space on the land, as it had been before the cottage was built. The demolition was a catharsis. All those years of dithering about what to do with the ruin, all those years of family argument and avoidance and lack of resources, financial and emotional, gone with the dump truck rumbling down the road. Maybe there were ghosts from the family before us who felt the relief as well. I don't really believe in ghosts as material apparitions of the dead, but our dead live with us as specters in the mind. What do they ask of us? It seems at the very least they ask for stories that will hold them among the living. This is no less true for our ecological losses than for our familial ones. Heavy machinery is not discerning in the way it unmakes things, but a carpenter, now that is another matter. Larry worked to strip down the plaster walls of what remained. Having worked on houses old and new on the island for 40 years, he kept an eye out for surprises that would emerge from under the plaster. Carpenters around here leave time capsules for those who find their way decades later into the interior of a house. I found this house built in 1864, written in carpenter pencil on a plank in the old cottage, and the shed had been signed on a ceiling plank by Harry Dunbar, as if it were a painting. Larry keeps up the tradition. He left a time capsule buried in the wall of the boat barn he renovated for me into what I now use for a summer cottage, a secret compartment with a Pepsi can, and this written in Sharpie. Conversion Reno by Larry Small, August 9, 2013. Gas, $1.35 a liter. Beer, $23 a dozen. A cool, damp summer so far, lots of herring in the wares, and reports that a great white shark took a big gray seal off Swallowtail Light. Cool shit. The uncanny thing about demolition is the objects turning up accidentally found their way into walls. A shell button that slipped through a crack, sure. A mouse skeleton, of course. But how did the hand-carved wooden shoe last end up nestled between the wall studs? And the tiny awl with a needle point that fit the prick marks around the shoe last's perimeter? Someone who lived here either made or repaired his own shoes. And the heart-shaped padlock, big as my fist, rusted permanently open. The door handle, the tablespoon, the fancy brass hat pin with a big oval cut glass jewel. Larry had a theory for the hat pin that had fallen down with the plaster and lath of a ceiling he'd demolished. A child picks up his mother's hat pin from her dresser, a precious object. carries it away to his upstairs bedroom. Mother storms around the house, searching for the treasured ornament. There are not many ornaments in a 19th century fisherman's house. The child cowers in fear of being apprehended as a thief. As mother mounts the steep stairs, huffing with rage, the child hides the hat pin under the loose floorboard. Voila, it lands on Larry Small's head 100 years later. Once we were down to the bones of the old cottage, the beams and planks told stories, planks wider than any tree alive today in these parts, studs roughed cut with bark intact on the uncut edge, square-cut blacksmith forged nails. Larry was surprised to see at one juncture where mortise and tenon met, holding together two beams, that Roman numerals had been punched with a chisel into the wood to match up the 6x6 beams, XII on the rafter, XII on the vertical beam. Cut to fit, then assembled like an IKEA kit. Directions right on the structural elements. I don't know why I found this discovery so moving. The maker's hand was evident in so many aspects of the cottage's bones, adze marks on the beams and such, and yet this crisp detail made me feel so much love for the labor that went into the house, for the intelligence and practicality of marking the beams this way as they were cut in preparation for assembling. All you need is one 2-inch chisel to mark all the Roman numerals as high as you need to go. Not all unmaking is so felicitous. Down with the mildew and anger go the order and joy of a family breaking bread together, the binding love of family and place, no matter the hardship. Generation to generation, place brings people together and tells them who they are. Place is a vessel that holds us, Aristotle said. Death unmakes all families in the end. That is our insufferable reality. Yet place opens again, a vessel to contain what comes next. Unmaking is nature's way of making, picking up the pieces and figuring out how to put them together into a new form. Compost, leaf mold, humus, dead herring for the cornhill, cow dung for the alfalfa, mushrooms popping out of a deadfall tree trunk, stories stitched from scant threads of those who have gone before. Maybe I was just following nature's lead in the demolition, unmaking so I could clear the way for making. I wanted to honor those who'd come before me. Since childhood, I have felt a kinship with my island neighbors, drawn to their close relationship with the sea, their love of stories and shared memory of those who had made possible their lives in this place. I wanted to hand over my place in better shape than it was when it came to me. This sentiment quickly ramifies into a cultural concern these days, when the unmaking of nature races forward in flood and fire and the foolhardy dismantling of that which sustains us and lends beauty to our lives. Just how far can the unmaking go before the making becomes impossible? I have set myself the task of imposing upon that uncertainty some meaning to be found in memory, lost knowledges, the silences of our dead, and the work of human hands that keeps stitching the fabric of life together whenever it frays. Thank you. Let's see. I think I have time to read this little account of going out to Seine Aware, and then I'll end with a poem. These wares, they're built close to shore. This is much bigger than you can probably imagine, but it will have to accommodate 3 or 4 vessels when they harvest the herring. The herring swim into shore at night as they're feeding on plankton, and then these wings of the weir channel the herring in, and then they're caught, and they can drop a seine net down and lift the fish up. But the herring carrier and I use herring and sardines synonymously because most of the sardines that we eat are actually juvenile herring. The herring carrier that has to get inside that weir may be 80 feet long, and it's in there with a lobster boat and a couple of skiffs. So it's quite a phenomenon. I'll give you a account. This is a sort of weird conflation of men's voices being out on the boats with them when they do this harvesting. It's a just astonishing thing to see. And I feel privileged every time that fishermen let me go out there, but they know me since I was a kid. So, you know, they're extraordinarily generous in teaching me. And there's a whole history of this weir-based fishery in the Maritimes in the book, in the Sardine Dress, going back to indigenous fish traps and fish weirs in the streams in this area. But this is near the end of the book, so it's a weird leap, but let's take it anyway. This chapter is called At the Seining, and those of you who are reading for my class, the Joan Didion essay, At the Dam, that tiny little essay, you'll hear that I've stolen the structural elements from the first few paragraphs of that essay, Theft. And it has an epigraph from Henry David Thoreau from his 1851 account of being on Cape Cod. Salt fish were stacked on the wharves, looking like corded wood, maple and yellow and birch with the bark left on. I mistook them for this at first, but such in one case they were, fuel to maintain our vital fires, an eastern wood which grew on the Grand Banks. So I perhaps should say the herring are of little concern conservationists. They're among the most abundant fish in the sea, and particularly in the North Atlantic. And civilization is built on herring. The Amsterdam is said to be built on the bones of herring. The herring and sardines, because they're so cheap and abundant, they fed workers in the mills and the mines of the Industrial Revolution. Salt herring could be transported because they were so heavily salted and smoked. They didn't need refrigeration. There are even accounts of from enslaved Africans on southern plantations. There's an account by a man named Francis Frederick of being given one salt herring a day during the winter months, in addition to what they usually got, which was some cornmeal and some salt pork. So the history of herring, I mean, it's unbelievably interesting to me, but most people don't think much of it. But it is an extraordinarily important fish. And here's the end of a traditional fishery in the Bay of Fundy. Since I was a child on the island when I first saw the seining of a herring ware, the image of that bounty has never left me. I'll be talking with students about the ecology of metaphor or scanning photos of absurdly elaborate ball gowns from the Gilded Age, and suddenly I will picture the graceful twine draped over birch top poles, the poles lashed side to side with manila wrapped just so the gauzy light softened by sea mist filtering through nets, the little squares and rectangles of netting that have been stitched in place to repair tears. The team of men pulling together, all hands leaning over the gunwale, hauling and hauling to bring up the catch that will fuel their vital fires. I will picture water sieving out of the seine net and the mass of fish rising until nothing remains but herring, a thrashing mass of glistening energy fighting against its fate. I hear the slow growl of the carrier as its pump labors and the loud rush of water sluicing through the scuppers as the fish are parted from the sea and ride down the chute into the carrier's hold. Deeper and deeper they pile up. And yes, it is not a beautiful thing for the herring as they smother in the fish-heavy hold. I sometimes wonder what it is about the weir that makes me think of it at times when I might have thought about Christo and Jean-Claude's running fence. Herring wares always looked more like art than work to me, the shape so pleasing to the eye, so hard to take in at a glance, requiring a second look and a third, and a few questions about how the mechanism works. It's the thing that can't be understood without understanding the thing it was made to catch. The Atlantic herring, the silver darlings of the sea, the most abundant fish in the North Atlantic that come to shore in massive shoals at night to feed, being specialized on the forage of Calanus finmarchicus, a rice-sized fatty copepod vastly abundant in the region that supports the food web from herring and shrimp all the way up to whales. With waters warming and currents changing, and Calanus liking cold water, this entire relationship is in jeopardy. A simple way to put the situation is no copepods, no herring. According to Graham Sherwood, self-described as the jack-of-all-trades fish ecologist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, if copepods move north for colder waters, herring won't make it to the Bay of Fundy. But 2008 was a summer of surprising abundance when the bay was full of life again after nearly a decade of quiet years, when whales were breaching again near shore and porpoises were entertaining everyone and herring were swimming into just about everyone's wear. A story once again of bounty. The herring with their tinsel flash scatter the light. Silver is their camouflage. They are nearly transparent in the water. The sea has made them and they wear its colors, silver, blue, gray. They move as one, the shift, the swerve, the underwater flight. If you move, I will move. They all say that together. But it's not just bounty that moves me about the herring harvest. It's also the quiet accord among men working together, a syncopation in which everyone knows his role, knowledge passed from father to son, father to son, father to son. The cooperation, skill, and stamina. On the day I write this, Junior Ingalls, at age 90, stands on a skiff in Pat's Cove to seine his ware. It's not unusual to go out on a seine boat and find 3 generations of men working side by side. I hear their voices all commingling now, after a few years of listening to words that have new meanings because of the wares: wings, bunts, pounds, shut-off wares, bar wares, ballasted wares, stop seines. Of the hard work of those who came before them, they say they had herring scales in their eyes. They were brilliant just to survive. Respect for their elders is founded in understanding the meaning of work in such a place. I hear their voices leaning into story that rides on the spare necessity of being understood among those among those expected to understand them. Any herring in Pat's Cove? Just enough to keep the shags, which are cormorants. Then the ware is full, the seine net mended, the seine rings lined up on deck to fall just so along the ware's perimeter so the diver can fix it to the bottom. Okay, let's go fishing. Get your oil pants on, boys, we're all gonna get wet. And then there's the waiting. Too much tide yet, still running. Then the tide is slacking. Take your time, just creep that thing around, not too fast, it's hard on the boys' hands. And then it's all ropes and twine and diesel thrum as the carrier enters the ware, the skiff just kissing its bow at a right angle to help it thread the needle into the ware. And then the pumper takes its haul and the carrier, the Andrew and Dean, rides lower and lower in the water, and night has come and no one has really noticed. Herring ware, all dressed and empty, is nothing but a hope and a prayer. Herring ware, all dressed and full of fish, is an exaltation. This is a gift, said the ware man. This is a gift, he repeated, when one carrier was full and another was required. No moon. Stars fill up the sky. The Milky Way is so dense, the milk has spilled everywhere. The dipper shines in the northern sky, abundance above and abundance below, and here in the middle, we find our way in the dark. Someone stirs the water and it glows. See that fire? That's what they're eating. It's a long wait for the second carrier to make its way in the night from North Head. The Andrew and Dean is loaded and ready to go. The skipper calls out, "We can stay till the other carrier gets here, so you have light." Dark night, skiffs bobbing, seals snorting on the perimeter. We don't need light. And the Andrew and Dean, on the last night of summer, rides low and full out into the night. So I would love to take you all out on one of those boats. It's and I've got a whole PowerPoint. If you want to someday see it, I'll show you how magnificent it is. I'm going to close, more fish. I'm going to close alewives are a relative of the herring. Like salmon, they move up into freshwater streams to breed, and they're probably among the fish that were first harvested by the Passamaquoddy people in the region, and they're very, very, very early weirs found on some of the lakes that we're pretty sure were built by the Passamaquoddy to catch alewives. I taught in Exeter, New Hampshire last summer, I guess it was, and got to go on a field trip with the students, which was awesome, on the Swampscott River, and learned about this amazing thing that happened, this beautifully hopeful thing that happened with the removal of some dams on the Swampscott River. And this poem is going to be in Scientific American in November. The science writer Davis Sobel is curating a science page in every issue of Scientific American since, I think, January. Liz, you must be in there, I hope. Okay, I'm going to write to Dava. Letter to 2050. The Swampscott River grew lazy in early summer. Muskrat rose and dove, heron swept the air, then landed, and hemlocks that had survived another century's practice of harvesting their bark were thriving. Some had suffered beaver girdles and the predation of woolly adelgids, but still, the pileated woodpeckers found what they required in the snags. This is how it was for us, pulling threads of hope out of the air, as if we had the skill to weave them back into webs. We surprised ourselves when it worked. So much needed to be undone. And I promise you that, as paltry as our efforts may seem to you, no, I won't justify our failures. The story of the alewives' return, that's what I wanted you to know, because it helps to think of desires that last for centuries without being satisfied. How far inland did the alewives come, I wondered, when the dam was removed after 300 years? In the first year, they came in a rush. Locals could hear the gulls gathered in the estuary in their joy, and the alewives swam and swam to the reaches of their ancestors. 11 miles and 300 years of appetite for place their genes remembered and knew how to find. The Abenaki offered a welcome back ceremony, and fishers gathered, human, cat, and bird, to feast, and the memory that had been suppressed for centuries became a fertile flow. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alison. Gallery, could you unmute yourself and give her a round of applause? And folks in the audience, please place questions in the Q&A. I think Alison will take some questions now.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah and I will moderate them. If in the gallery has a question they'd like to ask, just jump in.
So far. This one's from Melissa. It says, "Thank you so much for this gift, Alison. The lobster essay is one of my favorites, and I needed to hear you read it right now. I wonder how soon after your brother's passing you were able to begin writing about grief."
He died on Memorial Day on 2011. And I would say I wrote lots of really things that aren't poems. I kept a journal. It was desperately painful. And I know others who've lost people recently, sometimes you really are immobilized. It can, you can't find the words, just as many of us feel even after these deaths that are going on our streets right now. And George Floyd has done that to so many of us. It's like, what are the words? What are the words? What are the words? But so I wrote, and I don't know. I think I probably didn't finish. I did that little lobster ritual that fall. So it was probably 4 months after. And I just felt, you know, we'd had a tiny little family burial, which would have meant little to him. And I just felt that I lacked no ritual. We weren't a religious family. And, you know, so I came up with this goofy idea and of finding something that he loved with which to honor him. But it took a few months to get something that felt like it could be an essay. I mean, I think at first there's a lot of ragged writing in the state of extreme grief, but people can experience it so differently. So, but to expect one to be able to be clear about that grief in the immediate moments when it's still keeping us somewhat dormant, I think. I think that turning inward is a necessary part of what happens in grief. So it took me a while.
Emily.
Kind of goes along with it. I mean, I understand when you're talking about, you know, you write a lot of things when you're going through grief. But I guess my question is, how do you know when you're ready to put it out there, to let others read it?
Yeah, well, the first few times I put that out there and read it, at the end, when I got to the part where I'm having that little conversation with him, I could hardly say those words, you know, about how close he was to the spirit world. It was so raw. So that's one thing, is knowing when this is a private experience that you must hold to yourself, because the emotions are genuine. You have to honor them and move through them. And when you're ready to share them. I don't have an answer for that, other than you might start by sharing it with someone close to you, you know, before you kind of put it out there for a publication or go to a public reading with it. But I think it's such a unique process. But I think for many people, there's a deep interiority that is the first phase of grieving. So it's, you know, be generous with yourself and let yourself do that. Yeah, and sharing it, you know, start with someone you really trust.
This has a question for you.
Yes.
You know, for someone who moves between essays and poems, I'm so curious to know how you do that and how you decide which genre to explore, and what the dynamic is as you move between essays and poems. Do you find yourself immersed in one, immersed in the other, or is it more fluid than that?
It's kind of fluid. I mean, writing a nonfiction book is really demanding. And so when I'm doing that, I'm usually not writing a lot of poems unless something announces itself. Like, you know, when the COVID thing started, I was walking in my neighborhood and suddenly everything, you know, and travel that I had expected to take had been canceled. And suddenly it was spring in the desert while we were quarantining. And it was, you know, the bizarre juxtaposition of that, that feeling that was hard to get my head around, that became a poem called Territory Drive, you know, looking at that walk as if I had made a trip to, you know, Spain or something. It's trying to feel the grief of our collective society in facing this. I think that I write nonfiction when there's a lot of content that I want to work out, or I really want to learn something. I want to, like with the lobster, I said, well, I don't really know much about the natural history of lobsters. And then you find out they've been on Earth 600 times longer than we have. It's like, holy Moses. Moses. So essays often are things that come out of the desire to learn and to incorporate research in a personal story. And poems usually come out of maybe it's a constellation of images that sort of trouble me. Maybe it comes out of a register of voice I haven't used before. I'm working on a series of poems called Dear America, where I'm trying to love America at this moment while I detest and I'm utterly outraged and filled with disdain. And I know that I cannot do that if I want to be useful and hopeful and build anything that will help the future. So I think complicated emotions, wanting a different register of voice often will be a poem. But, you know, it's a gut feeling. Poems will often, I don't know if this happens for you, Liz, poems will sort of arrive and say, excuse me, I want you to write me today. And I may have to work on it a long time, and I do revise a lot. But poems come to the door, and when they do, I try to always let them in. Whereas nonfiction, it's kind of like I'm going to the office.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
There's a question in the Q&A from Melina Mingle. Your writing about makers is beautiful. Do you engage in a particular maker activity? What is it, and how does it feed your writing?
Well, I used to sew a lot. I don't anymore, but because this grandmother lived with me when I was growing up, who had a small dressmaking salon in New York, and she had 12 or 14 women working for her, and they were making, you know, custom-made French fashions for the wealthy of New York. So they were in this sort of middle artisanal class in New York, and we talk about that period of the very rich and the very poor, but there was this middle class of makers. And she taught me to sew. I sewed a lot growing up and as a teenager and when my daughter was little. But I have to admit, when I lost the treadle Singer sewing machine that she taught me to sew on, and I had to use an electric one, and then when the electric one broke, and a few years ago, I went out and I bought one. It was all full of this computer stuff, and I just could not form a relationship with it. I understood a sewing machine as a mechanical device I pumped with my feet that had a leather fan belt, or the fan belt, or whatever that belt is called. And so I have stopped sewing. And so I don't engage in much maker behavior other than gardening and making trails. When I'm on the island, I've built a trail system that's about 3 miles long through the forest behind our house, and build and maintain another trail going from our cottage down to the beach. And that is a tremendous pleasure for me. But it's a good question. My maker desires go into writing, and I think very carefully, like the way Scott does, you know, about making a piece of writing is like creating some fine thing made of wood where everything has to fit. I'm not a first thought, best thought Allen Ginsberg writer by any means. I believe in the maker attention. I love being lost in the maker attention, where you questioning and reshaping and rethinking, and what's the form, and what are the building materials, and what store of language have I not visited to help build this thing. So I think most of my maker stuff goes into that. Cooking too. I love to cook.
Some ways this next question kind of ties with that, thinking about the structural components, the craft of it. This one's from Rebecca in the audience. It says, I like how you write both horizontally and vertically and bring it all together beautifully in a memorable ending. How do you know how far to go with the vertical writing, that is historical or biological story, so that it doesn't go too far or detour away from the horizontal line? I want to become a better vertical writer. Hope this question makes sense.
Well, I've never thought about that as vertical and horizontal. It's really interesting. I was wondering which was which. So the research, which I think is her vertical, the research material into history or biology. Well, I've been very curious all my life, even as a child, and I love researching things. And I don't love being self-absorbed, as all of us as writers are somewhat. And I really, I think I talked about this a little in our craft conversation. I use the verticality to try to stop the flow of self-story, self-obsession, to say, okay, well, what is going on that is interesting here that I might learn something about that would bear upon this story? And, you know, in particular with this book, The Sardine Dress, because I could find so little fact or information about my mother or great-grandmother. And because even this fishery on the island, where the islanders, have held this history, 2,500 people for a long time, there were things about that history that were lost, like the early remains of what were stonewares out in the bay. I had to go out on a private plane to find them, and then the islands were, oh, there's no stonewares, and there's like, oh my God, there's stonewares around here. And now everybody's looking for the stonewares and finding them. So I just find it so interesting then to say, when we don't have the history, when we don't have the information or the data, can we understand something about what was going on in the culture of that time that might have influenced my grandmother and great-grandmother and determined who they were and how they could work and what they did, and what was going on in the culture, the early settling of this island, that shaped and determined who they became. So I'm really committed to this thing of the self being a cultural construction and trying to learn what that means for me as a white person. I'm a 10th generation New Englander. There's so much even of our history that is suppressed. And we're the ones who are supposed to have all of our history out there. But the erasure of lives that have mattered, because it is the lives that hold power and money that get told, is a task for all of us to defy erasure. And I think that some of that, what you're calling verticality, is about that. It's like, wait a minute, what haven't I seen? What might I see that I might bring in here? I'm not sure if that answers it. I want you, I wish we could go have a coffee so you could talk to me about why you call that vertical and horizontal. I love it. But maybe it's the forward movement and then the moving into building something on it. So I hope that helps as an answer. Somebody posted a comment that because I have this background, my body jumps around in it and it looks like I'm shedding my shell like a lobster sometime, because it doesn't hold me steady. I like that. Thank you, whoever posted that comment.
There's a question from Vanessa in the audience. Your love and connection to the Bay of Fundy and to the grief of the loss of plant and animal species to the climate crisis comes through so profoundly. I feel like I'm there with you even though I've never been there. Your work gets me thinking about the relationship between knowing and experience and grief. Knowing, experience, and grief. I had a student in a climate change class ask me matter-of-factly, why should I care if corals die? It stopped me in my tracks. Can you give us some insight about facilitating connection to the earth and grief through writing and its connection with climate resilience?
Well, that's why I wrote the book Zoologies, and I talk a little bit about this in the intro. I'm not surprised that a student asked that, because that was one of the motivations for this book. Because it's the same thing for me. I'm talking about the extinction crisis, and there's the guy in the back row, slumped back, who's rolling his eyes and throws his hand up and says, "Why should I care about this? I just want to get my degree and get out of here." And it threw me back, and I had to write a couple hundred pages to try to answer him. I mean, why should we care? Because we are moral creatures and we have been created to care, and we are vessels of empathy, and our empathy is inadequate. And the destruction of the natural world is not, because we have this bifurcation, well, there's nature and culture. People will say to you, if you're concerned about the fate of the animal world, well, you care more about animals than you do about people. You can't care about one and not care about the other. And COVID is a good example of this. The incursion into the animal world, the increasing incursion into wild places and interactions with animals with whom we haven't interacted, are bringing viruses to us for which we have no defenses. So you can't say, I mean, the entire global system, not only with our food sources, but with our susceptibility to pathogens, is linked to the animal world. So even if that's the only self-interested way to look at it, there's a self-interested reason. But I deeply think that it is the same pathology that leads to racial injustice, that leads to the extirpation of the animal world and the plant beings as well. And it's a mindset that, you know, it's a mindset of the imperialist. It's the mindset of those that are blind to the dignity of the lives of others, the rights of others to fulfill the greatest destiny that they might be able to fulfill, and to provide those habitats and environments, whether they're human or natural, to support them, to leave room for them. I mean, if we are the capacity for human cruelty is profound. It is profound. And we see it in the way we inflict that cruelty upon our fellow conspecifics, our fellow humans, and upon the animal world and the habitats of the animal world. This is something we have to work on. We evolved as ferocious hunters because we evolved in a place where there were gigantic predators that could eat us, and we had nothing but our hands and the tools we could figure out. So we became an aggressive and vicious species. Those were skills that served us on the savannah. They no longer serve us, and we don't know how to outgrow them. It's like, you know, when you go into therapy and you learn that you have behaviors that you learned in your childhood that helped you survive, like me, slamming my door and screaming in anger and hating everybody around me, which do not serve you in adulthood. You know, we have to outgrow our cruelty and our aggressiveness and become the moral creatures that we can be. And I don't see these things as separate. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't remember what the question was, but it was about what you should tell the student who said, why should I care about the extinction of one creature? I mean, the other thing is, of course, the great metaphor that all of life on Earth is a tapestry. It's a weave. Okay, you can pull out this thread, you can pull out this thread, you can pull out this thread, you can pull out this thread. Nobody knows how many threads you can pull before you don't have a cloth anymore. And we're getting close to pushing that with climate change. And of course, those who suffer the worst will be those who are already the least advantaged. One should care because, as we say, what ecology teaches us, everything is connected. If you have the capacity to slaughter one thing, you have the capacity to slaughter another, and you better curtail that as much as you possibly can if you want to be a decent animal.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat that is asking about how place influences writing. So having a lifelong cultural relationship with water, do you find it challenging to live in a dry climate away from oceans? How does it influence your writing?
Very much so. You know, it troubles me. I do write a little bit about the desert, but not very much of it. I've been here for 30 years. Some people have written about how, you know, the landscape that you're in when you're in your childhood, 7, 8, 9 years old, maybe the landscape that you form deep attachment to, maybe the landscape of your imagination that you'll always be drawn to. I mean, people are very resilient and adapt to new landscapes, but for me, that island has been such a place of studying the relationship between nature and culture, because you cannot peel them apart in an island that's entirely dependent upon the marine resources and the wiliness of the citizens to both harvest and protect those resources. So, I mean, it's just been, it's occupied my imagination. And I have written some about the desert, but I will say that and I don't understand this, but the vastness of the ocean for me is like conscious expanding, you know, it seems like a beautiful metaphysical thing to see the expanse of the ocean. The expanse of the desert I know it is, you know, in many religious traditions is the place of spiritual trial and discovery. But for me, I feel very vulnerable in the desert, you know, because I understand that I am, and that the cleverness of adaptation and the organisms who live here are mind-boggling and a little bit scary. There's a lot of poisonous stuff out here. But I've also learned that in the desert, there are a lot of communal relationships, like the nurse-plant relationships, you know, with the young saguaro cactuses. Ones that are successful are the ones often that will sprout under a mesquite tree or a palo verde tree. So they have the shade of that tree serving as the nurse when they're very young. And then they may manage to succeed, and then over time kill the nurse tree because they'll suck all the nutrients out of the ground. But there are a lot of communal relationships in the desert, in the plant world, that are extremely interesting. And I think some of it is just pure pragmatics. When I'm here in Tucson, I'm teaching. I have a very demanding job. I'm writing, but often I'm working out of journals from when I had a lot of time back on the island in the summer to write. So part of it is the quality of attention that I have when I'm up there is much greater for writing than when I'm here and so distracted.
Thank you.
I mean, in Temporary Homelands, I tried to write about the fact that, you know, I felt we were doomed if we could only love the places that we had had a lifetime relationship in. And I thought we have to be able to write about, you know, the title of Temporary Homelands was to suggest, you know, we have to be able to write about loving places that we don't know well, that we're new to, that we want to form a respectful and informed relationship with, where new relationships with people and with difference are necessary for us. I will say that, so the nature of moving to the desert has been a little alien to me and has remained so, but I think the most revolutionary thing that happened to me in moving to Arizona was it completed my North American education, because I grew up in a very WASPy family. I moved here and it was the first time I'd lived among Latinx population and Native American populations that are still dynamic and thriving. And, you know, this was a necessary part of my education. And so I have treasured the opportunity to live here and learn something about an America that was invisible to me certainly for my childhood. I mean, the fact that the Spanish were here before the Plymouth plantation, you know, we have a deep, long Hispanic tradition in this nation that we don't take seriously and respect. Anyway, I would so ramble on. But you know, certain places can speak to you in different ways, and I think that's probably the most interesting dynamic for me. Is the Northeast seems to be profound in nature for me, and here it seems to be profound in culture.
Thank you, Alison. I think we'll end with that. So gallery, if you guys could unmute yourselves and give her a great round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
and good night.
Good night.
So